Don't be intimidated. I've actually got a lot of notes for this one.
Do you?
As I say, this,
I'm fascinated by what you've seen.
it'll all be uncovered. There's no hiding it.
I thought I
look at that.
didn't have that much of a footprint.
I wanted to start us off, just like, and this is a bit spontaneous, but this here is pumpkin soup, I believe.
Yes.
That you've just handed to me, as in like, oh, you missed the community dinner on Wednesday, and I thought maybe you'd want to have some pumpkin soup, and I don't know if you have a way to heat it up. And if there was ever an action to kind of summarize, at least in a small part of us knowing each other, you and your actions and stuff, that kind of, I'm going to put it away in the Coles bag so it doesn't get warm.
Yeah, so it's got some carrots in it, lots of garlic in it, and pumpkin soup sort of can turn out one way or another, but I think that batch turned out okay.
Oh, real. And you're not grooming me, Daniel. Like, what is the purpose of this pumpkin soup?
You mean
as in like the community dinners and stuff that we've been going to? Can you describe what exactly you were doing?
That is about? I applied for a job in chaplaincy coordination at Western Sydney University, 2015, and got the position. First, they created the position. They're proud of themselves as a multicultural community. There was a realization on the part of some people there that religion was a big part of that, and I had sort of gone from a very religious role to a more cultural role over the last 15 years, before 2015, and I think probably that was somewhat what they were looking for. So landing at Western Sydney with this question of what does a relevant chaplaincy practice look like here, and especially creating a space for as many students as possible that might be interested in engaging with that, has really been an interesting question, and it's come down for me to safe space. So religion can be a very not safe space for a lot of people.
So I just completely had it in my head, and this is completely derailing what you're just saying. It's beautiful. But the one thing that your internet digital footprint does have, if you're curious, is that you like pirate radio.
Really?
Honestly, this is kind of pirate radio. Anyway.
Well, I do like pirate radio.
Get into that.
I like pirate radio. I'm amazed that you found that. It's like, well, have you watched pirate radio?
No. Wait, I looked it up, and AI told me that pirate radio is just people like truckers or something on illegal like radio wavelengths or something. But is it an actual show, or is it?
It's a movie.
Oh, okay.
It's a movie made. I think it's based on a true story of these guys who were banned from playing rock and roll the way they wanted to in England, and so they got a ship and broadcast
from just
like
offshore
classic rock and roll, and this group of people, pirate, who were just dedicated to really classic rock and roll. You must watch it.
Okay,
You must watch it.
Put it on the list.
It's a interaction between institution and authority and bohemians, and that I find that relationship to be really interesting.
Okay, so is that something that you're maybe having to be not just the poster boy, but the actual like agent of in this kind of university thing of like, there's this institution, there is an institution and all that kind of means and has to play by the rules and stuff. But then there's a bunch of young uni kids who are bohemian in their own ways, and some of them are super religious, and then there's another institution thrown in there, some of them just aren't, and rolling around barefoot, uni, and you're the guy to bring that all together in harmony. Is that?
Yeah, so I have to say, to tell you, Tim, I don't entirely understand that myself, but I am probably, it is the biggest thing I'd like to try to figure out at this point. What's my relationship to that dynamic? What I do know is that I feel a huge sympathy, maybe affinity, for those who have been left out or marginalized, and that includes the queer collective just as much as it includes Pacific Islanders who have for some reason fallen out with the strong church structure and who are feeling that they've been banished from the community because they're not keeping the faith. So that happens a lot in these settings where the boundary between in and out is so strictly enforced. And if you cross it, you compromise us. You bring compromising influences into the purity of who we are. You know, the word pure is never spoken, but it's big in religious. So something in me, probably because I was a migrant at 5 and struggled to fit in to this Australian life, or struggled to figure out where I fit into this Australian life for other reasons. I'm drawn to the people who cross the line, who move between places. So I think the big word for me at the moment, probably of the last 2 months, is bubble. You know, I'm struck by how many of us live in a bubble. You know, some people would call it an echo chamber, where you're only hearing from people who are like you or agree with you and so on. But you don't actually look out or beyond that bubble, and you don't really get a sense of the broader horizon or the other. So I'm just fascinated by that dynamic between inside and outside, and the university in its sort of curious role of clarifying, educating, growing. You know, growth has to do with breaking certain boundaries, limitations. So coordinating chaplains who, when I started there, were all only there because some religious institution paid for them to be there and could vouch for their orthodoxy. That orthodoxy sort of functioned on campus in very sectarian ways.
Okay.
And I think most students saw it as a sectarian function.
I have to choose one of these. So, like, what are we talking, 10 years ago-ish, like, the uni situation? Because far out, like, I mean, I'm not that old. I started uni the first time 6 years ago, and only lasted, it was mid-COVID, I only lasted a year or so.
Yeah, interesting.
But especially, I mean, everywhere it seems to be, there's a lot of talk about basically the fall of, you know, tertiary education. It's
the fall.
Yeah, like it's I hear in my like echo chamber bubbles of online worlds, which are probably more conservatively leaning.
And conservatively, you mean politically, religiously, socially?
All of the above, perhaps. I don't know, probably not religiously, but you know, there's a lot of talk about the left took over the likes of Harvard and the Ivy League, and the academics, which are always been, you know, left-leaning academics, are always going to be left-leaning, have kind of taken over these university spaces. And I mean, for me, that's not so relevant because I feel like I can go out into the world and make up my own mind about things. But it's obviously a concern for a lot of people. But like the general, and I certainly I still feel like this in terms of a business degree, for instance. Like the modern day, you know, you have the 19, and it's not a joke because it's real, and it's not just like the 1%ers. It's like the 19-year-old kids making 50 grand a month selling, like, you know, drop shipping this from that and all sorts of crypto and YouTube and blah blah. Like a commerce degree, for instance, is setting you up to be a great stockbroker, but not a great CEO or not a great founder or whatever. And that seems like similar sentiments seem to have kind of been whitewashed along the whole university kind of scope. For something like these health sciences and whatnot, that's obviously not the case anymore. But interestingly, it feels like they're way less politically minded, and there's way less like political talk, and we're not, how do you do CPR on a gay person? Like that's just not a part of the course because it has to be more based in like an apolitical reality.
Yes.
So has there been a noticeable shift in your career that's shown the uni stuff, and how is that coming out now?
Well, I mean it's shifting hugely, and to some extent, when I was saying, there are three things in life: relationships, money, and framework.
Well, it seems like the money is the big one, and all these international students coming in and paying 50 grand a year. I think I read that 1% of 250,000 students in Australia, which would be about 1% of the, existing population at any one given time, is international student.
Yes.
And all the apartments they rent and all the cars they hire and all the fancy shoes that the Chinese in Melbourne will wear around that are like a grand
interesting.
Like it's a huge part of this economy and it's wheel functioning.
Yeah.
And then their families who come in because their kids have got like kind of gone in the back door through student visas can buy up these crazy properties.
Yeah. Yes.
I think there's a lot of resentment around the place as well, like about all this stuff. And if it's your role to provide cohesion and unity and the human experience when it's going so unhuman and so online and whatnot.
Yes.
You seem like I have a difficult task.
Well, there's another side to the money piece with international students. There are those who are coming here on a shoestring and have presented themselves as being able to afford this, but they and their families say, we don't know how we'll afford it. Go work, figure it out, and they are. They're working hard in order to pull themselves out of poverty or pull their family or community out of poverty, and to get themselves in a viable position to compete, to survive in this global economy. So there is, the role of the university to bring those up, those people, and it has been a huge equalizer on the money question. There's the other side of people that are, already very comfortable. And interestingly, you find many of the people who came from poverty, who have gotten into viability, then become very material, and oftentimes for me, I'll talk to somebody about, how's climate change affecting your mindset? And they're like, oh, no, not interested. I come from a background that it's, that's a privilege issue. And it's like, but, then you realize they've got a big house, they've got cars, they're stuck in a material mind frame where they're not interested in climate, they're not interested in sort of building whole community sort of things because they've on this path.
It's almost like you need a few generations of wealth to then buy the grandchildren or great grandchildren.
That's the truth of my Polish community.
Wow.
Those folks came from incredible poverty. 60 years on, some of them are working for huge houses and so on. But that's where the money question hits the framework question. Because at some point, if you're young and you're earning 50,000 a month, at some point you will possibly, if you're at all thoughtful about it, hit up again against this question of what's this all mean? What sort of value am I bringing? What am I selling here? How am I treating other people? So if you ask the framework question, then it begins to.
And what is this framework question? Well, just specify.
I think the framework question is, what's this about? What's my purpose here? What do I contribute? when I leave, what do I look back at and say, I did good here, I did my best? Those are the framework questions that in religion are framed in certain ways, and there's a reward, or there's salvation, or there's history, and so on. But really it comes down to an individual. An individual working through, have I contributed? Where have I come from, and what's the meaning of all of this? So to your original question, I think that we get into trouble with words a lot, and when we talk a lot, as as we are here, at some point, I think you have to stop talking and cook.
Right.
So for
this
me,
is so interesting.
So for me, that I realized a few years into it that it's like, we've got to watch out for the talking here. The talking really gets us into trouble,
especially in like a chaplaincy role or one like it, where it can just be meetings and talkings and meetings and newsletters.
Debate, how does the Prophet Muhammad compare to the Prophet Jesus?
And you're just doing this in this sect of the university that 98% of the students and stuff don't even care about, let alone have access to.
I think they choose to think that they do care about it if they're given the freedom to explore it on their own terms.
Sure.
So some of the most spiritually provoked or introspective people I've met don't want anything to do with institutional religion, really have some difficulties with the baggage that comes with that.
Yeah.
And yet they're deeply engaged in questions of meaning and framework and relationship
I've met a few people,
and money.
Like including myself, I think I just like, I feel, I get the sense, I understand people who are part of a religion way more than I understand people who aren't, because it feels like I'm living, and see this in friends and other people as well, like living religiously is not part of a religion, if that makes any sense. Like,
yeah, again, it's such a spectrum. I'm tempted to get personal here, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure about
what I always say to people is say what you want as if it's just me, and if it's, I'll show you after, and we can cut out whatever you want.
My mother and father, both gone, sweethearts, did their best. My father was the elder in the church, and the way he lived his life wasn't really anything I'd like to emulate. My mother was never a preacher, very devout, but no great position in the church or anything like that. But she lived a certain religious devotion that was all about kindness and all about looking out for people who are left behind, loving children, and making them feel safe, and so on. That's the spectrum.
You had this dichotomy between your mother and father,
and that's living religiously. I mean, people will say the church is for everybody, and there are all kinds of people in the church, churches, in the mosques, in temples, as there are outside. So the question of living religiously, I think, is just an incredibly individual thing, and religion tries to frame it. If you do this and this and this, I've got this little grandchild. I have a feeling that perhaps, some point there'll be a question about should they be baptized, and the notion of a tiny child being somehow
scribed
or something by the notion that they're sinful and they have to be baptized in order to be.
Oh, is that what it is? Is that what baptism is? Like wash away your sins?
You can't be saved unless you're baptized.
Oh, really?
And a child who's just like this perfect little human being, there's nothing wrong with them, why we would go through a routine to cleanse them through some process of, it's just fascinating to me. But these are the questions of living religiously, according to whom? So that's a big question for
Fascinating.
and I think you've got to come down. So I choose to come down to a really individual level of accountability, of responsibility, of intuition. You know, what's it for you? You work that out, and that conversation, I think, is better if you cook first. You know?
If you offer them, like, hang on, here's a free dinner, and then if you want to, and if you are walking into it, like I guess I am right now, you know, talk about, then we can, and I'm going to be here for that. That requires, just so I'm sure you're aware of this, requires infinitely more effort on your part, because you can't just stand on the lectern and preach, say this is the answer, this is how you should be. You have to humble yourself. I'm going to be hospitable to you. I'm going to serve you.
Peel potatoes.
And
55 kilograms of pumpkin on Wednesday night. No, but food does that. You know, I think nature does that. You know, I think there are music does that, art does that. You know, so there are these things that we do as humans that are profoundly spiritual. You know, where the thread of spiritual integrity flows through these things, but we tend to devalue them, you know. And I would say that religion has a role to play in devaluing these things because they're not enough. It has to be
harder to control, harder to pontificate from the kitchen.
Too socialist, too down on this level. There's no hierarchy in it, you know, and yet that's where it's at. The lacking of hierarchy, the sort of the hummus, the humanness of music and art.
That's true though, isn't it? Like, you know, you can imagine a great band, the Beatles or something, came up with my grandma last week, and when people listen to that, even if it's 60, 70 years later in their car, they can be just going around the car, but at times there'll be a certain note, a certain lyric that just transports them deeper internally and into the whatever. And I certainly felt that when I would guide people into the depths of water, as you said, nature. Like,
interesting.
if we're going down, you're holding your breath and you're learning about your body, but also, like, I try to bring people's awareness to the beauty of bubbles and water and volcano, and like, and sure enough, many times, as if they were invited in subconsciously, we'd be an hour in talking about the most deep, you know, like things that you're never talking about otherwise in that medium of a meal or a music or a...
And I imagine you find what often happens, you know, people get in those situations and they weep because something flows. So there was this beautiful, a few years ago, the Blue Mountains tourist system had these big billboards of the Blue Mountains, you know, the big canyons there. You must go sometime soon. And it says something like, remind yourself how small you are.
Oh, in comparison.
In comparison, it had a human being in the context of this huge canyon. And
that was the advertising.
That was the advertising. It was this big picture of the Blue Mountains, and go remind yourself how small you are. And it was just a beautiful statement. And the notion of how small you are is not a put down, you know, and you know that it's not a put down. It's actually just a contextualization.
I wonder how that advertising campaign would have worked on the kind of person who has been wealthy for 3-4 generations and is now concerned about climate change versus the kind of person who has found it in their own lifetime or maybe their parents and is living in a new build mega mansion. How that campaign would affect both parties differently, because I don't actually know. Maybe it really touches a chord with the new money and like wakes them up and jolts them out of this materialistic sense for a moment, or maybe it just completely like gets scoffed at, whereas this person already on the kind of internal guilt of like you know, is really drawn towards it. That would be interesting to see.
Absolutely.
Market research.
And individual, you know, what prepares us to be open to that? You know, what creates the capacity for asking those questions, whether you're rich or whether you're, you know, here again, money, relationships, context, some point ask the question about what this all means, and then the relationship of money to that, wherever you're at, is really interesting. So uni hopefully begins to ask those questions, or at least creates a capacity to think about those questions, to have some handle on how you begin to engage with those questions.
That's the purpose of uni, idea.
I think, and that's what we're missing. Uni's losing its losing its way because it's becoming so transactional, I think, and it's just the shortest route between how much I pay for this and how the job I get.
Well, it's such a
coming
means to
out
an
of
end
it.
because it is completely lost all that human touch. And the image I reckon I would have had as a kid growing up of like a university was roll around some ancient hall, Oxford, Cambridge vibe, and it might be a wintry day, but there's a kind of fireplace with a professor reading, ancient books, and it's just like, there's a few board games or heated debates about, the realities of something, like this almost Harry Potter-esque, like, academic environment, which is so, like, the exact opposite of my experience, whether it's, out in the kind of very new build areas of here. But even University of Melbourne, which is a more like, kind of prolonged, ancient institution, ancient's probably the wrong word, but the Bluestone and everything like that.
Yeah.
Even that didn't have anything
Yeah.
remotely like approaching that stuff.
Yeah.
The closest I probably felt to it is, congratulations, those Wednesday dinners, right?
Yeah. Good of you to say.
Is that like the main thing that allows you to do that? Like the Wednesday dinners? Or there are other things like that? Like what else are you able to?
I mean, there are the economic issues. There are students who are not eating well and who need some support with making sure they get one good meal a week and so on. So there are those considerations which are important and certainly motivate us. But on a primary level, from my position as a chaplaincy coordinator or inclusive communities coordinator, we've inserted that word so that it clearly signals what this is about and what it's not about. There is that, there's that, when you envision the professor with a fire and books, there's a mysticism about that addresses a bit of a culture of, there's more to life here than just the transaction, than just go work for money. Somehow, if you don't connect with that in your life, the framework question,
I can't imagine it.
It's going to be unaddressed or unfulfilling. Or
is that a lot of what you see in students, like in the way they talk, in the way that? Because I see that. I was talking about this with a friend. I was like, there's actually this door knocking thing I might have mentioned. It, for me and for most, I would say, was not the right context and framework to operate within and then continue going down. But what it did have is, for whatever reason, because this is this old idea of, making your destiny, blah, blah, most people there were young and had fire. They were on fire, they had passion, they had curiosity, they had motivation and emotion and whatnot. There's an interesting thing my mate mentioned, that every girl who went into that job with a boyfriend ended up breaking up with a boyfriend because he was, for better or worse, just kind of an average bloke in Australian society, and then naturally being compared to all her workmates who are these guys that are on fire.
Interesting.
And again, on fire, burning is probably the wrong fuel, but nonetheless on fire. And when I go to uni, I don't see a lot of people on fire. Some more in paramedicine, for instance,
Yeah.
because it is like a thing that might attract, like, you know, that
Yeah.
I'm like, oh, hang on, guys. But when I'm traveling backpacking, almost everyone's on fire. Then.
Yeah.
Like,
Interesting.
even for that moment, that
Yeah.
6 months they've given themselves to
Yeah.
be so, like.
So what kindles that? You know,
Right.
what kindles that? Golly, you know, the university's surely got to be that place where you line up the sticks, and you start with little, and then you put hardwood on it, blocks, and you blow on it if you need to, if it's not going, you know, if there's not air in there or something. But at some point, when it goes, it has an effect that you can't neglect. You'll go do other things, but you come back to this thing that warms you, that brings people together, that will heat your food for you. You know, I mean, this gets down to primal stuff. You neglect that primal stuff, and you're a shadow of yourself. So this is again where the sort of money, relationships, you know, huge clues in there about at some point, always perhaps, like what's the framework here? What's the big question here? What's the purpose of all this? So yeah, fire is an interesting metaphor for that.
I'm very interested then to start going on the, like, tracing the journey, your personal journey, if you don't mind. And its ups and downs and, like, highest, like, you know, hottest points and maybe coldest points. I saw that you, in 81, I think it was, started uni. Was it in Chicago or something, or somewhere around there, Michigan?
I did do some work at the University of Chicago.
Yeah, well, like
Andrews University, yes.
So,
yeah, Andrews University, yeah.
Riding the clock back, like, why did you go to America? Were you living in Australia and went to America?
I was living in Adelaide.
Okay.
Yeah, I was doing a degree at Adelaide University.
Right.
Yeah.
How on fire were you? I know this, you know, it's hard to sometimes take you back into that mind. But when you were that undergrad uni student, what was going on in your own story? What was the landscape as well?
Yeah, interesting to go back there, Tim. You know, to some extent, I was. I think I came from a background of like significant pleasing. You know, it was a strong religious cultural community where you really tried very hard to please
what kind of religion
the elders. So I grew up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Okay. What is that?
That's a Methodist outgrowth, American, early 1800s, along with Mormons, Christian Scientists, Seventh-day Adventists. There was this New England revivalist thing that happened, very strict religiously, very much about the end of the world is coming, very much about only a small group will get it right, and they're the only ones who will.
It's like a puritanical cult.
Very much a puritanical cult, you know, very much in that puritanical tradition, but in my case, there was a cultural sort of finish on it that was Polish. So these Polish people had come here as refugees mostly. You know, the war had devastated Poland, so it was incredible poverty. So in 1963, when we came here, you know, Australia was promise and possibility compared to Poland, you know, just wrecked after the war. So in that context, you realized your parents struggled a lot to make this migration, to try to get their feet on the ground. It would be disloyal to not do whatever you could to please them, to support them, to be loyal to them.
When you were growing up.
Yeah, to be loyal to them culturally, religiously. You know, a lot of that dynamic was oftentimes putting down the Aussies. Look, the Aussies don't know how to do music. They don't know how to be close. They don't know how to do religion. They're just sort of, we know, this is the way these minority communities build themselves up and create cohesion with each other.
Do you see that a lot?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
But keep on going.
Yeah, absolutely. It's
because I think as like maybe you prescribe to that, like put yourself in that group now as well, but as like, an Aussie, as a white Australian.
Yeah.
I mean, I try to see the beauty in things, but I definitely understand and respect the reasons why so many just don't like Australian racism essentially.
Yeah.
Not to forgive it, but maybe to explain it is like, it makes sense on some degree. It does feel like a lot of these groups come in and are not just unwilling to assimilate in any meaningful way, but actively against it.
Yes, absolutely. And racism doesn't just go one way; it goes both ways, and people pick up on that. So I know in that context, there was such a disrespect for a lot of Australians. On the other hand, Australians who were kind, who were open, and there were many, you collected those experiences, and that gave you a sense of promise. Oh, I can survive here, I belong here. And that's really what allowed us to assimilate and move. We arrived here when I was 5, so there was never an option of being Polish. Really, we had a sort of a Polishness, but we were Aussies for the rest of our lives. So anyway, but that's sort of where it started.
Yeah, there's people laziness.
And I think that the loyalty to religion and culture, don't you dare marry anyone except Polish, don't ever become one of them, those sorts of things just cultivate this distance. And the more distance you put between yourself and other, the closer you are. But that it's just the bubble again, that closeness comes at an incredible cost. And you see it. I see it Western Sydney all the time,
I have so many people in my mind right now who now, usually, whether it's Indian or some other culture, are having the same battle with their parents.
Absolutely.
Now,
absolutely. And parents, come here, at least from my experience, parents come here wanting the economic benefits. They don't want the culture. They want some of the culture, but they want to pick and choose the culture. They want the economic benefits, but don't you dare become one of them. So there is this unspoken.
Because again, like a lot of these white Australian, I see it on Facebook and stuff, or whatever comment section all the time. It's like, well, Western culture, Australian culture is the best, because why the hell else is everyone moving here?
Absolutely.
But as you say, it's actually probably not likely that they're coming here necessarily for the culture if it's just an economic factor. But then again, a lot probably are coming for the culture because, if you're a woman, I'd probably rather be a woman in Australia than India, for instance. But and then I guess there's a whole other facet to that. It's like, we're just coming for the economics, and they're only rich because they stole it from the, those places anyway. So.
Complicated questions, but the loyalty to that. When I was at uni at Adelaide University, I think I realized that there was I had some growing up to do, and I don't know what it was. I'm tempted to think that Gough Whitlam had something to do with it.
Okay.
In the 1970s.
I know very little about
it.
What's that? Is that that's the Bob Hawke.
Prime Minister who got sacked.
Yes.
But he brought incredible attention to sort of decolonizing and art and various other things. And I was going through high school at the time. I have a feeling that it might have had something to do with that to some extent. And
real quick, what did he? I don't know. I know nothing about him. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, Gough Whitlam came after years and years of conservative governments that had sort of cultivated the White Australia policy, that had invited migrants to come here because they needed workers, but weren't really open to it. In fact, post-war, Australia was a very racist country because they were worried that are you okay here, or shall we move?
Maybe we should move. I don't know how loud it's going to come up in their mind.
Yeah.
There's a lot of noise there.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, maybe let's find one as well.
Yep.
All right, 5 seconds.
That's that.
Perfect. Alrighty, get out of the way of the exercise group.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, the audio filtering's pretty decent, so I don't think it'll be too bad, but
Great.
it's more just distracting for me. I don't even know where we were.
Yeah. Anyway, I think the question was, where did you start from and how did you get out?
If you're doing that and you're in Adelaide Uni, like, and Gough Whitlam is left-leaning influence.
Yeah, very much so. And my family, very conservative politically, still are.
To break you out, like, even just the idea of, like, I've always presumed that everyone and everything with sense is like, voting this way and thinking this way. And then I go to this university and listen to this Gough Whitlam, and it's like, but he's making sense, but but my parents taught so vehemently against that. So it's like Yeah.
So I don't know how it is that, I've tended to go to the progressive end of politically, socially, but I'm sure a lot of it has always had to do with some form of inclusiveness, some form of seeing the community as needing to be inclusive.
Because you grew up in the opposite.
Because I grew up in the opposite, and ended up going to seminary to some extent because in that community, that space was the space where everything happened.
What is
in
seminary?
That seminary is theology school, school of religion.
Yeah.
So there are a number of factors there, but the church space was sort of the primal space to really engage community most for me.
So all these random, because you roll around Australian streets, I'm just thinking about this for the first time, but you see a lot of random buildings, often that look like houses or mini churches, and they're like, Seventh Adventist or whatever it is, something I've never heard of before. And there's never anything going on in that building. I'm like, what is this? And would you say that majority of those, and this is like, I'm asking you to paint a broad brush, but majority of those weird places are kind of just the central hubs of these niche, in-out group communities in society? Like, is that a fair take?
Those places probably can be complicated, but they are hubs for sure. And I think that we are tribal beings. We need to belong. Chaplaincy at Western Sydney University for me comes down to, how do you get 48,000 down to a scale where that 48,000 students, how do you get 48,000 down to a scale where a person can feel seen? A class will do that perhaps if it's face to face, if the professor engages, tutor engages, but
it's also the students, man, because I was saying this, I don't think to you, but last night, out of the 4 subjects I do in first semester, one that has no face to face, it's anatomy, so it has a few labs.
Yeah.
But the other 3, 2 of them feel like basically bludgers, like they're kind of, you need to do them because it's just part of the thing, but no one's caring about it.
Yeah.
But the paramedic subject is like, people are engaged. And there's such a marked difference in the way I emotionally interact and to that material even. Because of the class and the community. It's so different to the other 2.
So here's the fire.
The
metaphor of the fire that you're using. Somebody there is tending that fire, and when you go there, you're warmed by it, and it lights it up. I've sort of moved, as you probably know from there, I've moved to Unitarianism. That's sort of been my practice for for the last 15, 20 years.
So when you said that stuff about living
25 years.
religiously without a religion,
Yeah.
that's what that Unitarianism feels like it is trying to get at.
It's broad principles about human dignity, about interconnectedness to all things human and non-human, but the symbol there is a chalice, a fire. You know, it's whenever they get together, they light a candle, which is representative of the fire, and when they extinguish it, they say we carry it in our hearts, we carry it in our minds. You know, this represents us coming together, but this is just the sort of collective. You know, oftentimes we'd have children light it, you know, or somebody who was really going through something difficult light it, you know, and when you extinguished it, you'd always say, hold it in your heart, you know, take it with you, you know. But it was that metaphor of kindling and warming.
It's beautiful. I mean, what's more
collecting.
human feeling? And everyone, I hope, has had an experience of being around a campfire, telling stories and getting deep or shallow with the guitar, whatever. Like.
Absolutely. And you know, anthropologically, culturally, backgrounds say the altar, you know, the white altar, oftentimes white marble in front of the church, is actually taken off from the pagan sense of holding coals warm, covering them with white ash. So the pagan notion of fire, you had to keep it. You'd cover it with ash, and the ash was white, but underneath it was held the fire. And from that, you know, has sort of grown this notion of the altar on which you put, you know, the most significant thing, whether it's a candle or whether it's a communion. So the fire thing is primal for us. Now,
So when you went to uni, to what extent did you start to? Was it that you disassociated from where you came from in this family? Where did you run towards? And what landed you in a...
Yeah. So a few things. I was doing music at the time, and so much of the music was come from the United States. I was also started reading some stuff in liberation theology. Not a Catholic, but the Second Vatican Council in '73 did raise questions about liberation. What did it mean for religion and church to actually function to liberate people, both economically and religiously? South American, especially priests, went back to these dictatorships. Many of them...
Yeah, because in the 70s, every country in Latin America essentially had...
Absolutely, and many of them were banana republics because banana corporations had taken people's land and were industrially growing bananas and indigo and coffee, you know, all stuff that none of the locals needed, but their land that they had sustained themselves off. And so these... And the church was very much in cahoots with the dictatorships because they wanted to stay in power, as so often happens. You know, again, this sort of curious in and out. But priests went back from the Second Vatican Council that had sort of held out this, what would it look like if the church opened its doors and windows to the people, and the people could see in, and the church could see out, and the church supported the people, especially the poor. So that was liberation theology.
But I presume that didn't happen in any meaningful way. Is that because the church already by that point was so caught up in corruption and dictatorship and stuff that it just was too scared to do that?
Yeah, and sustained itself. You know, the institutional church, as was true in Poland at the time, as was true in many other places, as could be said about Australia in some ways, in order to maintain its power, gets into relationships with the entities. I mean, look at the United States at the moment, gets into relationship with the power holders and protects its market share or protects its properties or its ability to function.
They don't want to have some dictator say, well, church has 5% of all the houses in this country, we're just going to strip them of it and
absolutely
give it back to the people and blah blah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's always been, but the liberation theologians, the priests, went back to South America and said, what would it look like if we were really on the side of the people? And that was a theology that wasn't that at the same time reverberated with women who were saying, what would it look like if we were equal? What would it look like if the distance between the poor and the rich wasn't so huge? So coming from Poland, where you were really interested in what occupation looked like and what liberated, what gave people opportunity, I just was really fascinated by liberation theology. And at the time, Father Gustavo Gutierrez from South America was teaching at Notre Dame, and there was no internet or Google or anything. Anyway, I had the opportunity to go to Michigan, and part of it was music, and part of it was, that's close, I can go over there and listen. And
how did you get that opportunity?
My brother was in Michigan at the time. He sort of he gave me some addresses and some ways to get in, so I got into Adelaide, Andrews University. I knew a little bit about it. Yeah. When I got there, I realized it was an incredibly conservative place.
Well, you studied, what was it? Off the top of my head, it was philosophy and systemic theology?
Systemic theology, yeah.
I was like, what is systemic theology?
It's sort of working through the principles of theology.
Okay, so this is the foundation for these interests that you were obviously accruing at the time. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk to you now about like what I imagine was quite basic and foundational stuff to build individual thought off.
Yeah.
But I'm talking to you 45 years later, so it's like it's an unfair comparison.
Yeah. So theology is, what are your sources of truth? How do you see sources of truth? Where do we come from? What is salvation? Soteriology. What allows you to be saved or to go on to another life. In other words, the systems of punishment and reward.
Yeah.
Theology is very much about that. Imagine that, that theology is so much about punishment and reward. That's a framework question.
Yes.
At some point when you ask the question of framework, it's like, really, is it about punishment and reward? So you have, Christianity, for example, takes a very particular view about the question of punishment and reward. Pay the price. And so God sends his son to die. Okay, paid the price. If you believe that, then you're good. If you don't believe it, then you're on your own and out. That's an incredible framework.
Yeah. I was speaking to, do you know, like the Bible studies people?
Yes. And CBM.
Yeah. Dan, do you know Dan, the guy who runs that at police camp?
I know of him. I know Simon.
So he was on the podcast a week or two ago.
Oh, was he? Oh,
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating, this idea of what you just said, this Jesus, like this fall guy. That I just I continue to not be able to wrap my head around that as an idea even. I mean, fucking believing it, I'm very far away from, but like, even as a notion doesn't even, I don't know, it just doesn't even make sense, which is, I think, the power of it, right? Because if you cross that, it's almost like, holding yourself up into this little Polish conservative community doesn't make sense until you're in it, and then it's everything.
Yes, yeah, that's
Similarly,
right. That's right.
When you're not in it, like, and you're on the outside, you have this whole, like, world, like, this whole Jesus belief notion doesn't make sense until you're in it, and then it's...
Yeah. Yeah.
and then it answers everything for you. So it's
Yeah. And it gives you a sense of belonging. You know, all of a sudden you see others who believe the same way as you do, and you sing together, and you comfort each other when you've lost somebody, and you deal with stress and various threats daily and more broadly by supporting each other.
all the base primal needs and wants and desires of any human are met by this community and stuff that is held together by that one linchpin of a certain belief or ideology or whatever. And you see that everywhere, right? And the successful ones touch those and orchestrate their framework to suit the human being that believes in it the best. Even touching things that you wouldn't even think. Like if I were to make a cult or religion right now, probably wouldn't think of half of this stuff because but it just without realizing it, maybe 20 years down the line, maybe 200 years down the line, you realize you needed that part to keep it active and surviving.
So when you ask about these weird little churches, all of them are about that.
Yeah.
All of them are about somehow a group of people met each other and became a we. And the sort of fascinating piece of that is that the we doesn't just relate to we when things are hard, I'm not alone. We when in the context of life's challenges, but also we believe the same. So that notion of we, and you'll hear people talking about we believe, that sort of thing. It would be interesting to think that you could, and this is the thing about Unitarians, and I'm not trying to convince anyone. It's just interesting to me that the Quaker or the Unitarian we is we in times of hardship, we when things are when we're grieving or we experience loss or so on, but not necessarily we believe the same. So the we differentiates between we can be together, but we don't actually have to think the same thing. We don't have to believe the same thing. In fact, it's richer if you've come to certain convictions and you share them with us, and they're not exactly the same as what I've experienced, because your experience is different.
So you're kind of recognizing that we are humans that want these base needs, and we want to feel this tribalistic we, but also we don't want to lose our individual divine sovereignty just to get that kind of more animalistic tribalism.
Yeah,
we can
still become a bubble. Because they so easily do, but the effort is to broaden it.
It reminds me. I don't know if this like analogy and parallel won't hold up. I'm sure at the moment's analysis, but my mind went to lifeguard clubs and stuff.
Yes,
life-saving clubs. It's like it's not. I'm sure most people in part of Newport Life-Saving Club kind of share similar stories and similar parallel worldviews and whatnot. But they're united by just like a useful action for their community, and B, by barbecues and dinners and just like I'm sure if someone's in the community, they might put out a newsletter and might send them flowers or whatever it is. I don't really know how they work. I've never been part of one, but
when you're 18, great-looking bodies.
Sure, exactly. So you get like you probably find your husband and your wife in that as well. Like
that's right.
That feels like a very. I mean, that's probably the most Australian, like Aussie version of this, because it is so secular, but so but still so useful and relevant.
There's a we in there, isn't there?
There's got to be a we in there.
Yeah. Oh, we're mammals. We've got to have that we, and that's where the question of inclusive, exclusive, really comes down to a hard question, depending on whether the line is hard or soft. So, if you've got that fire that we've been talking about, but you communicate, you can only be part of this fire if you not only feel the need for we-ness, but are willing to believe the same way as we do, then yes, come
We
in.
with us and no one else. It's
No
like
one
a
else, you know,
committed
distance
relationship.
between us.
Unitarians kind of have an open relationship there.
Open, yeah.
Cultural and spiritually.
It's spiritually, but belief-wise, framework-wise, but you know what happens at the uni a lot is you'll get these international students, or you'll get other students that see a fire there, you know. CBM might be one of those examples. It's lovely that they've got a fire there, but there's definitely a message there that, you know, you can only be part of this if you believe, or if you're open to being convinced about that, or so on. That's an incredibly difficult thing to say. Not
To the lonely
person
who's
who
hungry
wants
and,
we,
who desperately needs the we.
but isn't buying into the we because they're part of some other we. You know, you got students who are here from somewhere. They're incredibly homesick. They're looking for that. So that's a hard line.
And this is the
Again,
beauty of your dinners,
This
right?
is beauty of food, yeah.
It's like you can have the fire, and there's no expectation of I mean, there is no, at least as far as I've seen, there is no, like, you know, dependency. You can be we. I think you said this in, I don't know if I wrote that part down, but actually, I think I might read out this quote. Yeah, hospitality is the essence of the chaplaincy service's purpose. You are welcome here. You belong here. We are in this together.
Yeah, okay. Well,
Those are your words.
I'm glad they found the way. Yeah. Primal mammalian instinct that, to me, has to be the essence of, it has to be the basis.
That's beautiful, man.
Of it. And if religion isn't really fundamentally supporting that, then I want to be careful with it. And as a coordinative chaplaincy service, like if you're here to tear us apart, to divide us, which is different from celebrating uniqueness, you know, there's a line there that's really difficult to discern, because there is generic.
You don't want to, like, oh, you can't wear a hijab or can't wear a cross and
No.
this and that. And like,
No, you can't have your own strong belief. You can't want to subscribe to something devotedly, you know. Yeah, but not in a way that excludes other people. So that's the sort of difficult interface that we're always dealing with, and it's a beautiful thing to engage with. Not easy, but
it just feels like how I would imagine, you know, being a politician might feel, like a benevolent politician.
yeah,
Of like, I kind of have a vague direction of where we're going, but I believe so much in like a democratic, like, you know, everyone equal thing. That this system is just gonna move so slowly. If I wanted to make it in the right, it can move really quickly, but it's gonna be in the wrong direction. If it wants to move in the right direction, it's just such slow progress, moving a whole population, whether it's 48,000, whether it's however many in Australia, 27 million, like, you know, like, and there's a certain humility in being like, accepting that I'm more focused on the good direction, no matter how slow seeming that might be, than, you know, my ego getting in the way and like, look at all these changes and things, but it's fundamentally will need to be broken up to continue moving in the right direction.
Yeah, to be at scale. But interesting, because as you're saying that, Tim, I'm realizing that there are some shortcuts to getting there fast. And one of the shortcuts is make an enemy. You identify an enemy and, you know, all of a sudden you're moving. But that comes at a huge cost, you know. So
Cost of peace.
Yeah.
Literally.
Yeah, and yet you've got a lot of actors who are willing to engage these tricks. So it's a dynamic worth understanding.
Like, biologically, humans are way more motivated by avoiding negativity than running towards positivity. We're way more, like, they did a study on the rats, and it was like they had I think a bit of food or something, and it had like a pressure plate, so they could kind of tell how hard the rat wanted. I think they had a thing connected to their tail or something. So they were like running towards a piece of cheese. They could measure how hard they were running at the cheese.
Yes.
And they got, 1 unit of, motivation towards that cheese. Now, when they put the smell of a cat behind them, but the cheese in front of them, they ran like 10 times faster.
Yeah.
And it was that.
Interesting.
You still want the cheese, you still want the carrot,
but
the stick works so much more effectively.
Yeah.
And I've even heard this in like kind of life coaching spaces, and people trying to like figure out what they want, who they are, blah, blah, blah. It's like, yes, figure out what you want, but it's actually going to be more effective to figure out what you don't want to become.
Yeah.
Like, I might want to work hard to make $1 million or whatever.
Yeah.
But better to focus on, I want to work hard so I never have to worry about being homeless or this and that. Yeah. And that will fire you up way more, like biologically speaking. Because you can get it wrong, right? You can miss out on the cheese 1 time, 2 times, you might go a bit hungry. If you miss out on smelling the cat, you're dead. So the stakes are always higher.
Yeah.
Not being tuned into the negativity.
Yeah, absolutely. So fascinating to think that that we're so existentially wired to, on some level, to avoid death. What is it about us human beings that is attached enough to life on a primal basis that cat motivates us so much?
Just any animal, right?
Or any animal, yeah. Again, worth understanding. If you're afraid of dying that much, and you recognize that you're genetically or existentially wired to be motivated by that to such an extent, then you want to understand that dynamic and framework again, and understand what now people will use the trick, make an enemy, threaten people with hell, those sorts of tricks for getting it faster, but it might be worth considering. Okay, I want to understand this threat. So what is dying? What am I so afraid of? And how do I live more fully so that the carrot becomes more of my focus than the cat?
Have you noticed, maybe potentially now that you kind of lay it out and verbalize it, have you noticed a transition of that? I presume all of us start being far more motivated by the cat than the carrot. Like, do you have a clear thing of maybe going to America, maybe a certain position, maybe a role we'll get to later? Was there any obvious transition, or it's just like a slow thing? Or are you still at the more motivated by the fear than the love?
Yeah, I tell you what in retrospect is clear to me, and I do think I got this from my mother. I credit her with this, and that is that I remember the first time, I don't know how old I was, but I probably was at University of Adelaide, when I heard somebody talking about moral and ethical issues, and they really made sense, and they weren't religious. And I was shocked by that. I was shocked that somebody who was secular could be saying such meaningful things.
Could feel and have a soul.
Yeah, really. And I was shocked by it. And then I was shocked by my own shock. The idea that really I thought only religious people thought profoundly or were wise, and I think that was a big transition from cat to carrot for me, because that was that enemy thing, in my mind, my background had othered people to such an extent that you were aware of the otherness and you only found yourself deeply breathing or relaxing among your own people, which is so common for so many of us in our various tribes. I think that's where that transition happened. No, actually, there are people in the other part, outside of this, that I'm really curious about, and I'd like to understand where they're coming from and what their life experience has been. And that curiosity, that wondering, has taken me to some of the most profound places I've ever been. So, and each time it's like, wow, you know, these people are coming from a place of completely different from my own, and yet I have so much to learn from them, you know, so much to gain from being with them. That's a part of that existential thing. You know, you not only can survive outside of this, but you actually can thrive. You're actually enriched by the encounter with the other. So all of a sudden,
they have a fire as well.
They have a fire
And
as well.
if you're open to like, okay, I'm going to walk away from my fire, keep it in my heart, Unitarian, like, I'm going to wander around through the dark forest. Oh, there's another fire over there. I approach with respect. They let me, wow.
Yeah.
Can I, instead of just hulling to my own fire, maybe it goes down enough and I don't like the conversation at this fire, I can just start wandering through the forest of all these fires.
Absolutely. And you find that some of those fires, people are like, yeah, come on. This is where the pirate radio comes in.
Yeah.
The pirate radio is
Back to pirate radio.
they threw us out, but that's okay. There's a whole tribe of us out here, you know. And having grown up in a fairly authoritarian thing where, you know, the male to male relationship is anxious and is hierarchical and power oriented, all of a sudden to be on the outside, I mean, there's so much literature around this. You know, it's again one of those human sorts of things that happens to be some core piece of my identity, I suppose.
Yeah.
The idea that there is so much joy among the bohemians, you know, among the migrants, among the travelers,
the hippies,
who actually have wandered, and in the process of wandering have become really open and inclusive. Now, you can lose stuff in there, and
you can lose the ability to have the flint and stone on you to...
You can lose the ability on how to build a really good fire, but maybe not, you know, and that's that to be able to do both.
Yeah, keep on taking us on this journey of how we've got to these understandings and perspectives and lived them out and enacted them, as is so crucial, because we kind of, I mean, we're taking the pleasure of talking about this all now, but, you know, I think you've done enough action to earn it. Like, you're in Michigan. Like, what's going on here? You're in this conservative uni.
Yeah.
Where did this all track? Was that experience further being in a bubble? Were you being nourished, like, you know, academically? Were you kind of liberated and hanging out with bohemians in the street? Like, what were those years like?
Yeah, I got into trouble a lot. I finished school, and what they usually do is they place you to some clerical position.
So this in Andrews University was a
Seventh Adventist University.
Okay,
so usually they place you somewhere, and I do remember the chairman of the department calling me into his office one time and saying, "So, Daniel, at this point we usually place people in a position where they begin their career. We won't be placing you." You know? And it was like, okay.
Hey.
So he said, "You're not clergy material." It's just
and that's the path to become a priest or something, like
to ordination and so on. So I sort of expected that, because I was so on the outs with that sort of orthodox thinking and so on. So I got a position in Portland, Oregon, in a chaplaincy in a hospital, and that was my happier place. That was a place to apply theological training and pastoral care work in a non-sectarian space, and that's sort of been where I've stayed.
That's it. Yeah, so a place that's not just, I mean, yeah, granted they might be doing the odd, like, you know, fire stuff of, you know, dinners and talk, but a lot of talk in a church, I imagine.
Yeah.
And but hospitals, I mean, no one can take away the action, you know, and the usefulness.
Yeah, and you could become, you know, I realize that when I think about that hospital in Portland, Oregon, you know, some of the experiences, like I remember thinking, okay, what can I do here? What's my role here? And one of the experiences that I remember from that, and I had a wonderful mentor there. He was a guy who actually, there was in San Francisco, there was I forget what he was called, but he had killed like 12 people violently, and his daughter was the only person who survived. I forget his name, but he was a notorious
So he killed all his family
serial killer.
and stuff,
And she had survived that. Well, his son had survived that. His daughter had been killed in a car accident, and he was the head chaplain. That happened while he was a chaplain, so it wasn't as though he came to the position after that, as a reaction to that. But
He's the head chaplain of San Francisco?
He was the head chaplain of this hospital.
Right,
Portland Medical Center. And he was an incredible mentor.
And are you saying this chaplain's daughter was killed by the serial killer?
Yeah, son was the only one who survived. His daughter was killed in a car accident. But that had informed sort of a depth in him that was just amazing to be around. You know, his work sort of was informed by these horrific experiences.
I think it was Nietzsche is like, you know, look into the darkest of dark and see the lightest of light. Like, if you can survive that depth of darkness, I mean, the light that must be emanating out of you is crazy.
It was amazing. One of the big things I took away from him was that he would oftentimes sit with you in certain situations and not say anything. And you know, I remember earlier on, I'd be like, okay, what's going on here? And so on. And he'd say, you're uncomfortable with this? And, oh, no, man, okay.
Yes.
You know? And then he'd say, whose needs here? Your needs or somebody else's needs, you know? And it was a way of him saying, you know, you'll be in situations with people, you're going to be uncomfortable. Do you act on your discomfort because you need to say something? Or are you there for the people and their needs? Because if you're there for them, anything you say is going to interrupt their thinking. They're just thoroughly in their own minds going through what's next, and you know, if they're grieving or something. So just be aware of whose needs are being met, you know, because so often you confuse your own needs with somebody else's needs. I mean, in life, you know, the idea of whose needs are being met here. It's amazing how often you apply that, and the clarity it brings. Like, okay, I can see who this is about, you know.
Yeah.
So he taught me a lot, but there was some.
And I've never actually, sorry to bring it down to like, you know, but I've never actually thought of hospitals. I don't think about hospitals all that much, to be honest. And does each hospital have a chaplain? Is that a common practice? Is that a common position?
Practice in the United States for sure.
Okay.
Here too. Some hospitals pay for the chaplaincy. Some chaplains are sponsored by the denominations to practice at a hospital.
And their role is to like, is it? I'm imagining like a nurse is a bit PTSD'd out and need someone to talk to? Is it like an in-house therapist of kind, or is it like what is that position actually entail?
So, hospital can be a very liminal place. People are dying, people are dealing with crisis. Those situations really push their framework.
Yeah.
So in those contexts, people are really questioning, what's my framework? Am I afraid of what's coming next? Have I made peace with my family? Have I made peace with myself? Is there stuff I need to take care of? Am I wildly anxious in this, and it's actually contributing? Those are all spiritual and religious questions. People will often want to talk to their own spiritual mentors about those things. Those who don't have them will talk to a chaplain. The chaplain will connect you to different ones around these questions that oftentimes doctors and nurses either aren't prepared to deal with or don't want to deal with, because
it's mainly
slow conversations.
Patients and like loved ones of the patients coming to you.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, very much so. So chaplaincy deals with that big piece of religious and spiritual questions around the crisis of health, or around the moments of, people are afraid to go into surgery. Some people will find it comforting to actually pray at that time, and some won't feel confident that they can actually express that. So they'll want a chaplain or their own minister or clergy to be there with them.
I hope this doesn't sound like trite, but do you have any stories that are kind of like stories? Like, a police officer might tell their like craziest arrest, or paramedic might tell their craziest like incident they went to. Is there anything like that? Is it not the place to say at all, or is there like some sense of that kind of more monkey curiosity about things and situations?
Yeah. A few different stories come to mind. I tell you, one that comes to mind is this guy who was in his 70s, and he was a really highly respected lawyer in the town. Had been practicing law, big law firm. He had 4 children, 2 daughters and 2 sons. The sons were lawyers. One of the daughters was a really exceptional musician, and the other daughter, I think, was an artist. Anyway, really accomplished family, very high profile. And at one stage, one of the sons came to the office, and I had gotten to know them because I'd gone in to see him. He had been in the hospital for a few days, and the son came and said, "Can you help? Something's going on here that's just we're really freaking out." And I went, and the father, who was not going to survive, it was
this lawyer.
Yes, lawyer, was sort of in his last days there, but very cognizant still, was just weeping uncontrollably, just wailing, and the children couldn't recognize him because he'd always been this reserved, highly respected. I think he may have been a judge actually by then. And they were just freaking out. They'd never seen their father in that kind of condition. He had created a culture of high respect and holding it together and so on. And here he was wailing, and they were embarrassed because people were coming in, doctors and others. They'd had this reputation in the community. Yeah,
journey.
They were just the daughters. I remember they were outside and they were just pale with fear about what was happening here, which was hard way for them to. And it was interesting to go in and sort of sit with him for a while, and then at some point. Paul, I think his name was Paul. I just hadn't thought about this for a long time, but that was his name, Paul. At some point, after sitting with him silently, so that it was you know. Anyway, he started to speak about secrets that he had had in his life that he'd never told anyone, and the guilt of carrying that and his life was over. It was just like eating him up. And the more his children were there, the more he realized that he'd been disloyal to them, and had it was just this incredible. And he was not religious at all. He just considered himself to be an atheist and so on. And over the course of the next 2 or 3 days, there were just these conversations where, you know, he was able to talk about what he'd been through, and we were able to sort of put some context to it, and you know, really a confession of sorts. And then at some point, put it away, and the sort of crying stopped. I think he came to a place of resigned peace, but peace. And
a sense, like, was there a tinge of perhaps regret of, I didn't have to hold this for 30 years, or I could have acted differently? Or...
Yeah, absolutely. Why was it such a secret? You know, what was the price we paid for this profile that we were holding up that was dishonest?
It's a real thing to, like, if that's his, and it might be very aligned to who he is and how he was raised, but there's some, like, sense of fakeness and putting on a facade. And that's obviously how he's raised his daughters, for instance, as well, because they're themselves so tough and focused on external validation to not be with their, you know, daddy. Like, you know, it's just
Absolutely.
like, you know.
Here's who my daddy is.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden that's crumbled. It's not my daddy, you know.
Yeah, and that's whatever it is, whether it's a money, fame, status, to me, and I think to the realist of each human, that can't be worth it if that's the price.
Yeah. Yeah, and you pay the price. You know, the secret can be toxic. It was in this case.
I say that to people. I don't say this all the time, and I try to not be. I think of myself as a pretty decent bloke. And, you know, especially in the more bohemian, perhaps, communities I've ventured into, this comes to mind. But if anyone's still listening to this, it might be relevant for them, you know, like, people will sometimes not really, they might be very, you know, I care about the environment, whatever, but they'll, like, steal from Coles, for instance. It might just, self-checkout, you know, it's like, I don't have much money, whatever. You know, they're a big corporation. I'm like, man, I get you. Like, you know, it's not necessarily that that's a bad thing. I'm far less concerned about you stealing from Coles. I'm far more concerned about you bankrupting your own moral respect for yourself. Coles will never care. Shareholders won't. They don't matter. And no one will ever find out, probably. You'll know. And then your view of your own moral, you know, savings account will be going down exponentially, and that's the issue here.
Absolutely, Tim. And if you know this about yourself, you know it about others. And if you're hiding it, you're also suspicious of others, you know, because you know they have the capacity, are they doing it, and so on. But if you can find your way to principally not going to do that, you know that about others too, and it creates a different trajectory. Sure. You know, you start to see and act on the best and goodest version of yourself.
Amazing. You can then start to see that in others. And I think there's a real thing, if, like, I don't know what energy force it's playing on, but if you see the best in someone, they're far more likely, even if it's just around you, to live like that.
Yeah.
You know, you might have a friendship with someone and you see the best in them because you see the best in yourself and try to live up to it. So you see the best in them and you kind of almost will them to live up to it, at least in your presence. They might be a dog with the other people, but it's a certain element of...
Absolutely. You know, that's where we started saying it was both. It's the light and the darkness. It's always both, you know. It's the notion of positive. We like to be in positive spaces. That never protects us from some things that scare us, some things that we know about ourselves. Everybody does, you know. Somehow, the lines that we create You know, this is sort of where it comes back to for me. The lines we create about in and out and so on are so damaging to our own ability to hold both. You know, there are some things I do on the inside and some things I do on the outside. The line is stopping me from being able to hold both, move between the
Even that
two.
it's internal, external, on my own versus with other people line.
Yeah, you know, Paul, the idea that he's got this perfect image and therefore he can't be open about the fact that he has some issues that he needs to deal with because he's got this perfect persona that he needs to. Toxic, you know.
Probably literally one of the health issues he was coming up against would have been exacerbated at the very least by, if not created by, such tensions.
Yeah, at some point it comes out. And for them, they were able to talk about it. Really hard conversations. But
especially to cram them into the last few days.
Yeah.
They're hard conversations to have over a lifetime, let alone.
But, you know, going back to your metaphor of the fire, there was a fire lit in that room for those last couple of days. I remember looking in and thinking, don't interrupt here. There are conversations going on here that are, you know, the metaphor of the tree on fire, the burning bush metaphor. Sacred space, take your shoes off. Because there's stuff going on here that is going to be that is life altering, you know.
Well, it's nuclear,
corrective.
right? It's all this energy that was otherwise wrapped up in this smaller space of an atomic particle, like, you know, internal, some far corner of his heart.
Yeah.
Poof,
right.
All at once.
That's right. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, living a lie in a sense, and all of a sudden you let go of it and take the chance that your reputation's going to get a hit, but you're going to live authentically with your.
One of my favourite quotes from one of my favourite books is, I think there's a kind of flamboyantly silly character who's always throwing out these pithy lines, but they're not too pithy, they're quite funny. And someone tells him to like grow up or mature or whatever, and he's like, oh, that's nonsense, you know. I'm just willing to admit myself as being immature and a little boy, because the mature man, or the truly mature man or woman, invariably only has about 2 seconds left to live. It's like, if you really come to grips with the idea of maturity that we all have in our head, like you're actually never getting there.
Yeah.
The place that you think of yourself as growing up into and then actualizing yourself, or you're actually steamrolling to that, you know, end. Great.
And it's so much more fun. So much more fun, you know.
And letting yourself be that.
Oh yeah, yeah. It's you know, this is where the talking is a problem. You know, I used to have this. I think I probably learned this from a puppeteer in Vermont named Peter Schummann. He was a German guy who came over to New York City in the '60s, and he came over with this incredible ability to make puppets. And with his mother's starter, bread starter. And he would, on the streets in New York City...
So he had his two possessions were a bread starter and innate ability to create puppets.
And so he arrived...
like the little yeast thing.
Yeah, yeast thing, which each one has its own unique sort of thing, and you know, you culture, add to it. And he started in New York City, sort of starving artist, 200 bricks. He had it down to 200 bricks, and on the sidewalk he could create an oven out of 200 bricks. Dry laid oven out of fire bricks.
What?
200 bricks.
This in New York City.
In New York City.
What?
And he'd bake bread in there, and of course
on the
pavement, and the aroma of fresh bread. Baking would draw people, and so he'd have really good butter, and people would, and he'd do puppetry, and by the time I got to know him, he had bought a 150-acre farm in Vermont, and was doing puppetry workshops there, because he was a professor by that time at an art school in Vermont, near where his farm was. And once every year, they did called they did something called the Insurrection Mass. And it was a funeral procession for all the bad ideas that year. And that was when Nixon was in, and so on. and thousands of people. I mean, it came to the point. I remember he told me one time, he says, the most we had was 42,000 people there. What? And at one stage, the Hells Angels showed up and started brawls, and the state police had to come in and break the thing up. And he said, that's it, I'm done. Yeah. But for several years, there were like, 30, 40,000 people who would come. It was a week-long festival of puppetry. And at the end of it, there was a ball there, and thousands of people would all join this procession of puppets and art. Much of it that lives in this huge barn he has in northern Vermont. Anyway, he and I got to be friends, and we'd hang out quite a bit. And he would always say, Daniel, at some point you've got to stop talking. You've got to go garden. You've got to go cook. You've got to go pick apples. The apples.
I'm just trying to connect dots and say, did he buy a 150-acre farm, like off the proceeds of that bread? Like
he became. I mean, that was his start in New York City.
Okay.
20 years later, he'd done productions in theater in New York City that were very famous, and that's how he got to be a professor of. I mean, he became.
It is like that.
Look up Peter Schummann. You'll see his puppetry. Huge puppets of Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger and so on, that were like, okay, funeral for this idea. This was a bad idea. Oh, every year, the sort of. Peter Schummann, look him up. It's just,
one of the characters.
It's great art. It's fantastic art. And Peter is just an incredible human being. But something we were talking about. Oh, fun! The fun. At some point, music was big for him. He says, at some point we've got to stop. We've got to pull out the instruments and start dancing and so on. And that's that sense of you're speaking about the lightness and the other side of things. It's at some point you have to not take yourself too seriously.
Sure,
you have to have fun. You have to pull out the instruments.
It's very true, isn't it?
Put on the dancing shoes.
I'm definitely a young guy trying to figure himself out in the world and stuff. You can quite easily flip into that side. I think. I don't know how conscious it's been, but it is conscious to some degree of like, no, I need to let myself like be the idiot and look like the idiot, and find the kind of people who not just accept that, but quite willing and able and happy to like be the idiot alongside it as well. Because otherwise, what are you doing? Like, and I think it also is like a balancing scale. Like, the more of an idiot you're willing to become, the more serious you can take this. And if you want to take them really serious, then you can have to be a real idiot, or the other way around. If you want to be a real idiot, you have to take it seriously, or else you're just an idiot.
Right. So I've got this image of you sitting at the table at community dinner, and sort of observing what's going on around you, and being to some extent the outsider coming in, but also and here's the homeless one, the PC sort of. I mean, that's not the idiot, but it is a foil.
True.
It's like, from my perspective, I know who I am and how I'm seen, and the narrative sort of lends itself to like, some awesome. Humor, some relief. So it's great fun that you identify, you're using the word the idiot, but the jester has a similar, the observer, the one who doesn't. So you have to watch Pirate Radio. Watch it with Mum. She will appreciate it. If she's my age, then she'll appreciate it.
Yeah, one of the most outsider people I've ever met.
Oh, she knows the Pirate Radio, but I bet she will enjoy watching it with you.
Okay, so just to keep on filling in the gap.
Yeah.
We're in America, we're in Oregon, we're in this hospital.
Mm-hmm.
Is that where the story ends in America? Like, what goes on from there?
Yeah, I left the church. I left the sort of faith of my family.
Wow, how is?
Yeah.
Is that like a ripping off a scab wound here, or is it scarred over?
It's well scarred and healed.
Okay.
But but we moved back to Vermont. After I left the church, I realized I sort of needed to leave Oregon.
And there's a we in this now.
Susan and I both were of similar orientation. She was like, I can't.
So you were both in the church. Did you meet at the college?
We met at the college.
Yeah.
We were both. Her story's interesting. You know, her mother had a really tough relationship with a guy who she divorced, and then the church sort of shunned her because of the divorce, which was one of those interesting sort of things. So Susan and I,
and she's from Vermont, is she?
Yeah, we moved back to Vermont, and then for the next 10 years, I was leaving because I couldn't. It was hard to do that all at once.
Leaving the church,
which was seen as an act of huge disloyalty to the family, to the culture. I mean, my parents, to their dying day, felt that was the biggest issue of their life, probably.
You leaving
the fact that I had sort of shunned that and left the church. So it was those things are so tight, so highly defined that it's huge.
I guess it's like if you're a hippie bohemian couple and you have a kid and they end up being like a bloody capitalist, money grub or something. Like, is that a kind of a equivalent way to put it?
It's the same whether you're an Orthodox Jew or whether you're Amish. But
the religious side of things just doesn't make sense, I think, for most people, like including myself. It's like, I can't even. Yeah. It seems so like almost silly to a certain extent, because you're still obviously a really good person who's living very religiously. Why does it matter the religion? Like,
huge.
I get it though. If so, there's a complete like backflip on values.
Yes, right.
And that's kind of maybe how they perceive in their own sense.
But the doctrinal framework again here, the doctrinal framework is so important to them that the sort of way that they deal with the existential cat. Great metaphors you've used here, Tim. Yeah. The way they deal with the cat is, well, this life isn't the only thing. The next life will be eternal and sublime.
Yeah. So it's actually better to be inside the cat's stomach. That's a palace.
If you've got your act correctly here, in this case, the act not so much as the belief. Because there's a disconnect there oftentimes that's less important than the belief being.
It's crazy that part.
It's crazy, but
the part that's crazy, like sorry.
But yes, if you get your act together here, then if the cat gets you, it's fine, because the next life is eternal. That's true across almost all the religious traditions. Not in Buddhism, not so much in Hinduism, because there's a karmic sort of
you need to do the actions to get out of this wheel of enlightenment and stuff.
But in Christianity, Judaism, Islam.
I'm just being selfish in conversation here, but like that's I couldn't get when I was sitting down with Dan the other week. I couldn't get why this wasn't, because a lot of what the Christians and stuff say I really like and I really have all the time in the day for. I just couldn't understand why it was feeling so weird and jarring for me. And I think that's exactly what it is. This sense that don't worry about the cat, not because of the way you live your life and the actions and who you are and blah, blah, blah. It's based on the belief. But if you know, as a logical human, that I need to get in heaven to belief isn't something you can fake. Certainly to yourself, let alone to a God. Like, you can manipulate yourself and you can maybe do it, but at the end of the day, when push comes to shove, you can't fake a belief. So, like, you're either kind of in it or you're out of it. And how the hell do you do one or the other?
And you have to sign up to these 10, these 20 beliefs. And when you read through the beliefs, people don't read through the beliefs all that much. But when you read through the beliefs, it's like, really?
So it really seems like, from the outside, it just really does seem so weirdly obvious that, like, no, you're just, because you were born into it, because you were lonely or whatever reasons, like, you wanted all the human fire, food, community, singing stuff that came along with that. Yeah. And then you kind of warped yourself into, this is what it's going to take, and now these are my beliefs. Like, it's like this conditioned prescription, but
The we.
That's the wrong way around to do it.
The we you want and the we you have to adopt. Yeah, absolutely. And
So,
all of
yeah.
that is, so for my parents, the idea was, you know, okay, our life will come to an end. That's all right. We'll see you in heaven. But if you've messed up your beliefs, you're not going to be there. So when we say goodbye to you here, that's it. That's an emotional, psychological, existential permanence to that in their way of thinking is a dark place.
Were you
It's a-
seeing them have to internally choose, what do I believe more, the truth of this doctrine or the love I have for my son?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And alternatively for me, the love I have for my parents or the truth of this doctrine, you know. So can I love my parents but not necessarily?
I guess that's the Abraham story as far as I know.
Yeah,
It's like,
absolutely.
I have this biological, if we're divine monkeys, I have this biological love and yearning for my son and you know, your parents
Yeah.
have this and blah, blah, blah. But this God, who I also believe is asking me to test that. Are you more are you more divine or are you more monkey? Which are you? Are you a monkey or are you a son of God?
Yeah. And First World War poet Wilfred Owen writes the story of Abraham and Isaac in a beautiful way, recites the whole story, and the last two lines are post-World War I, but speaking about this heritage of belief and nationalism and identity and so on, you know, recites the whole story, knife held, and Abraham slew his son, and half the seed of Europe one by one. You know, so the poet sort of says, why did these old men send all the young boys to war, knowing that they'd be dying for country, for nationalism, for, you know, trying to make sense of it. So you know,
There's no God to stop it.
a version of this question of you know, loyalty to the life or to the belief. You know, I believe, therefore I'm even willing to kill the son. You know, I mean, the prodigal son story came to life for me. You know the prodigal life.
No,
So in the New Testament, Jesus tells a story about a father who had two sons, and one of them, the younger one, said, give me my money, I want to go.
Oh, yes.
And
I
so
do
he
know.
gives him money, he goes, he got friends, runs
Spends
out
it
of
all.
money in a pigsty, eating the pigs. Oh, I was better off at home. Comes back, father accepts him, open-armed. Brother says, I was here loyal all the time and he's been wasted all his money. Why should he get that kind of welcome? I had been asked to speak at this place, and my son was here in Australia and I was in the United States, and I said goodbye to him, and it was really sad to see him go, because so far, you know, probably wouldn't see him for a year, and we're close, and so I went back home to prepare this talk, and all of a sudden this sort of narrative is like, why the hell does that story have to create a framework where the son can only survive under the father's roof, and if he goes, he lives with the pigs because he's a failure? Having said goodbye, it's like, I don't want you to live under my roof all your life, and I want you to succeed out there.
Yeah.
You know, if you go out there, I want you to have everything you need in order to do brilliantly out there. You know, you don't have to, in order to reinforce who I am, fail out there. You know, but that's the story, you know. So you know, the Abraham Isaac story, the killed half the seed of Europe one by one story, you know, the prodigal son, it is a certain telling of, you know, the only place where you can really be happy and be safe is
As a son.
loyal to your father's place.
I did not expect us to get here, but I've had this quote in my mind for many, many years because it rings true. and it was saying that you really can't become a man, like boy to man. That journey requires the death of your father. Now, we hope that's metaphorical. You know, in my own internal frame of how I see myself in the world and how I act in it, my father is increasingly less relevant. Not that I don't respect him, blah, 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 but it's like, you know, I'm not beholden and under that thing. And I think has a lot of truth in it. I think it also explains the allure to Christianity or, you know, any religion, but also like the harm potentially as well, because it's like, okay, now if I'm a Christian, I always have this eternal, like, omnipotent father. And that's really nice, because suddenly I don't have to be the man. I don't have to take the responsibility and the weight of the world and blah, blah. And that's the whole point, right? Like, Jesus takes your sins for you and God's always there for you. So you can your whole life kind of be the son. But I think the maybe more secular view of, no, you had to kill your father, and there is no godly father either. Like, you are the man of your own life and destiny and situation. That, if taken, you know, the right way and applied in the right direction, is going to be more powerful, I would say, than just submitting to a religious prospect. But it's just so like, oh, but how can I cope if I'm all alone? You know what I mean? I want there to be, you know,
and you know,
cosmic daddy in the sky. Like.
And the framework is, again, is it either or? You know, now I have a relationship with my son. I'm pleased to have this relationship where I'm delighted at his successes. He's gone his own direction. He's independent. He's strong. He thinks for himself. He's not sort of adopted my religious views or my approach to things. Neither of us have to be dead. We can actually be in relationship to each other, which the either or mindset doesn't allow. You know, it doesn't have to be either or. It can actually be both. And to me, the real challenge is it's always both. You know, why can it be both? Anybody who sets it up as an either or, you know, either I'm faithful to God and I kill my son, or I'm unfaithful and I save the relationship. That's an either or that I don't believe the world.
Do you think that's the enemy thing? It's like, I'm creating this enemy so I can have this clarity of vision.
Yeah,
because I don't want to sit in the grey zone. I want it to be black and white, because the grey is so hard to operate within.
It's the loyalty thing, you know. It's this sort of heavy tribal, heavy cohesion that relies on distance from others. You know, how do you live to be able to be faithful to whatever extent you can without compromising your own intuitions, what you will learn, how you will outgrow them, and find friendships and interests in other places too that will welcome you and will teach you things you'll never learn in this particular place. The idea of both is just one of those big things in life for me, that it's not an either or, it's both. And the notion of your father has to die, what is that either or sort of thing, which you know, if you see the Heavenly Father as a projection of this relationship between, they did some interesting research, studied young men to figure out who made the most nervous. And so different ones would come into the room and they were able to measure,
like an attractive girl.
When do your palms sweat?
Yeah,
you know, is it your mother that comes in and you sweat? Is it a good-looking woman that comes in and you sweat? Is it a peer that comes in, you sweat? Is it an older man that comes in? the highest level of anxiety for most young men is when an older man comes into the room.
Yeah.
You know, this is the relationship we struggle with in a notion of nationalism, a notion of Abraham, Isaac, prodigal son stuff. Goes really deep for us. And I think probably is the cause of a whole lot of shit that we didn't need to put up with if we knew how to make room for each other.
So how have you been able to do that? Even like, you don't need to get personal, but it might be the easiest example to rely upon. Like, what is the answer against that? If it's so baked in our individual psyches, our societal psyche, like.
So I grew up with authoritarian men, church, family, dad, very authoritarian, very harsh discipline. You know, Dad said to me one time after Julian, my son, he's here already in his 20s, we were sitting somewhere, and he said, he's a good boy, you know, he's really respectful, and he's courteous, and he's smart, and, you know, and just off the cuff, and I said, and I never hit him once. You know?
Oh, you said that to your dad?
Yeah, I never hit him once, you know.
Ooh.
And it was just a reaction.
That's a dagger.
Yeah. And he turned to me and said, I'm sorry about that, you know.
Wow.
I'm sorry it had to be that way, or it was that way, and so on. But that's one of it, you know, that was, you know, something I experienced that I, you know, from when he was a young boy, I just thought, I could never hit this kid, this child, you know, and we just grew up being in a different kind of relationship, and that served us well, and we continue to be in a good relationship.
That must have been challenged at times. Yeah, I can't imagine through his adolescence that was always the way. I mean, my mind goes immediately to, like, you hear stories, and I'm not here to dictate whether it's, you know, media hyperbole, but there's always some truth to it, of, like, you know, weak fathers and absent fathers and teenage boys causing a ruckus and throwing rocks in windows, and teenage girls, for better or worse, you know, wearing the mini skirts and doing whatever they're doing, and it's just like there's a lot of, you know, this idea of helicopter parenting, letting them do what they want, and then there's the entitled little shit kids. Like, I mean, you might have personally escaped that, but you have to also realize that you're you, and you're very, I would say, a good person, and then your genetics flow onto him, plus you had the presence. Like, if those parameters aren't set up, are there ways to operate in a less than ideal situation?
Yeah, I think that one of the ways I think might be helpful here, Tim, is this notion of whose needs. You know, if I think back to the way my father was with me, and I think many other fathers, especially of that generation, were with their, you know, if I look back at it, it's like, I reckon when those discipline things happened, I reckon he took care of his own needs rather than mine. I have no doubt about that, on all kinds of occasions and levels, that he was pissed off, he was angry, and he catered to his
Even
anger.
if it was something you did, it was a reflection of him, and he saw the bad versions, annoying versions of him in you, and
yeah, he took care of himself, you know. And whereas it's like, okay, what does this boy need here? I'm angry, you know. Here's why I'm angry. Is it helpful to him to learn a lesson here? You know, why am I angry? You know, that's a reflective process that, first of all, requires a bit of a speed bump, a bit of a slow down, and understand what's going on. But those were always, I mean, there were occasions, you know, but somehow we always had a way of talking through that. Sometimes it was maybe later, you know, let's talk about that, or I don't know what it was. But it was certainly helpful to always be asking yourself, whose needs are we going to address or prioritize here? And that question for me, that I go back to sort of my mentor Cal, teaching me, was hugely helpful. Hugely helpful. I need right now, but that's my need. That's not that if I act on this need, it's going to do damage.
Go to the boxing bag instead.
Yeah, it's going to do damage. Don't do that, because it's not going to address what he needs here, which may be to learn some lessons or to so
I say. Do you, speaking about that, because it seems like, there's a few things. I've definitely appreciated that speed bump comment, because I've heard it in different contexts, in a business context of like, it's essentially not being reactionary, and you can usually make far better decisions, after a night's sleep in more cold blood, like not the heat. I remember someone describing it as like one of those thermos water bottles, of like, how much insulation can you put between your reactions and your actions, because that insulation is your logic and your ability to be thoughtful and empathetic and find the right answer, or at least a more right answer. Are you I guess willing to admit, or do you have, you mentioned it before and you included yourself in it, which I appreciate, like that ego, that selfish voice, that darker side, and I'm presuming I'm not sitting in front of like a megalomaniac murderer. It's not that level, but how much comes into play? Was it more in the past? Has it tamed down of like, just that less than ideal but human side of yourself, as someone who's literally made a profession out of whose needs probably not mine?
I have a tendency to avoid things. I recognize that. Certainly avoid confrontation. I'd go a mile to avoid confrontation. Maybe that's a positive. There are negative aspects of that avoidance.
To get Susan on to deliver it.
That's right. To leave the hard work to her. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think she would probably say that at times she needed to be the rule maker. So that's probably a weakness there.
And if you've lived a life of essentially habitually, systemically and professionally choosing the more right path, and it probably is hard to access the less right path, but would you say that if you can remember, if you can take yourself back into the inner workings of your mind as a younger man, like maybe in those transitional stages as later teenager, were there elements of resentment? Were there elements of just like entitlement, like why am I an immigrant? Why have I been wrapped up in this church? Like, I don't know what it would look like and what it would be. I'm trying to throw a fishing pole here, but
it's you're picking up, I suspect, on something, and I think you may or may not be picking up on something else, but as you were saying, I realize there's a passive aggressiveness to how I've coped with things that's probably a piece of that narrative, and that is that in an authoritarian situation, highly authoritarian, and probably as a migrant in those early days, heavy bullying from older Australian kids who I suspect that's my excuse for cultivating some coping mechanisms of passive aggression that meant that I don't confront things head on, but because the authoritarianism was too much, but I will
subvert.
I will do the pirate radio thing, but there's a little bit of a thing in there. And in terms of raising son or being parent or being a person even, I suspect that passive aggressiveness is probably a feature of how I've coped, and it's not a
so yeah, because I think passive aggression comes from the unwillingness or inability, perceived or otherwise, to have an actual weapon, actually be aggressive.
Yes, that's right.
But it's it's the first step of like, okay, I'm not gonna have a weapon and use it, but I haven't got rid of the aggression, or at least like completely internalize that and alchemize it into positivity.
Yeah, you're too big for me to fight. I can't fight you, but I'll say. I
still want to hurt you in some sense.
I'll say things that are gonna, you know. So there.
As a smaller kid growing up, I definitely wielded sharp words. As opposed to heavy fists.
Right.
For sure.
That's right, and that's a sort of a way of passive aggression. I think that's a feature of how I've coped, and it comes out of where I've come from. But it is something that I've probably needed to keep an eye on. Maybe that's a piece of my sort of speed bump. You know, don't go to the aggression.
Oh, it's definitely better. I think everyone's agreeing. Like half of the word is passive, so that's
that's right. That's right. That's right. So yes, in terms of your question and your sort of, I had a sense that you were reaching for something there, and I appreciate it, because it's like, oh yes, that is a feature, and it has to do with the story. But you know, I mean, it's just good to know yourself. It's so important to know yourself. Even my passive aggression, I can realize that these days, and sometimes I'll go back to somebody if I feel like, you know, it's like, hey, I'm sorry about that. You know, that's what happened here, I think.
I think it's quite clearly a good embodied example of certainly like self-knowledge, but also the inaction. I'm just going to check the camera. Are you going okay?
Yes. So what do you think? Shall we call it?
I've got
enough words, and
I might just keep on going through the American thing, but I think more or less. I've got so many questions still, but I don't know how much energy you got. Okay, if I'm choosing, I'm just going to pick like maybe one or two things. Because
thanks for being interested.
No, I know it's a long time, but like it's and it takes energy, especially if it's your own thing.
Well, no, it's sort of nice to have the time to go into it.
Yeah,
I've forgotten about the camera, which is nice.
Yeah, that's good. I'm glad. I actually didn't even check. I should actually properly check. Right. I was there, and I wasn't even checking whether it was working doing this job. Yeah. Okay. Cool. Tell me if you're slowing down and you're not enjoying it. But I've got, I mean, as I said,
another 10 minutes, shall we? And,
sure. There were so many things in Vermont, and I was just like, okay, you've got a lot online. There's like youth justice stuff. There's affordable housing, $9 million projects. Costa Rica, which obviously I pinged up on because I don't know if I told you I lived in Guatemala for a year and a half.
Oh, interesting. You didn't? Wow.
Yeah, and so if any of those things ping up and whatnot.
Yeah.
There's one thing was just which might tie it all together, and I don't know how relevant it is for you nowadays. But you said like 2007 you came back from a sabbatical. Even real quick, what does the sabbatical look like? Is that just prancing around Europe, or like?
There was a community of Tibetan monks outside Byron Bay, and they allowed me to come and join them for. I wanted to immerse myself in Buddhist thought for a time, and they made that possible. So our whole family went to Byron Bay. We rented a house for 6 months, and it was a great experience.
Wow. Okay. And the kids are going to school and stuff.
Sydney was in high school, and we enrolled her in the Byron Bay High School, which was just a very brave experience for her. Sure. But she got into it and did really well. And Julian did homeschooling, and every morning went to surf on Telos Beach, and every evening. And that framework of big ocean. He had learned to surf before, but
Because Vermont's landlocked, is it?
Vermont's landlocked. He learned to surf when we were here once before, and that just gave him a chance. 6 months of surfing twice every day, just focus his studies so that he was way ahead by the time he got back, because it was all up to him, and he would get up at really 6 o'clock. He was the first one up. He'd be out surfing, but he'd come back at 8 and study through the day, and then at 4 o'clock he'd
Ocean gave him some fire.
It did. It
And
was.
Are you living inside this monastery thing? Like, what's the? Are you just going there for dinners or something?
A combination of things. So I did retreats with them. I did Vipassana retreat, 12 days of silent retreat, which is
that scares me. It's one of those things where I feel like called to. I thought, oh, I should probably do something like that. It's probably on the menu, but like.
It's an interesting experience.
Have you done? I presume you've done.
I have. A really interesting experience, but great. The teaching monk was there during that time, so it was great benefiting from just learning with him and with them. Was a great experience.
Any particular? Nothing like it's just like the general coding of it.
I tell you what one of the things I took away from there, because it really informed what I was doing after when I went back to Vermont. He went to speak at the School of Law at the university that's in Lismore.
Okay.
I forget what university that is, but they invited me to come along with them, and so I went, and it was a sort of an hour-long conversation he had, speaking about law within the Buddhist set of teachings, and of course the students, which just couldn't wait to pepper him about this non-reactivity that he was teaching, and they were all over him saying, okay, if somebody's done this and this and this, how can you not react? How aren't you responsible for jumping on it and stopping it and prosecuting it and various things like that? And it was interesting knowing him and seeing how he was struggling with some of these questions. And at some point he said, he paused and he sort of, as they were giving examples of things and saying, why wouldn't you react to that? He said, I have to tell you, these situations that you're speaking to me about, I'm unfamiliar with those situations.
What kind of things are they talking about? Murder, rape,
he said, in Tibet, if we had a situation like that, our first concern would be, where did this person come from? What place cultivated that kind of mind frame, that capacity? We would probably focus on that individual, but we'd be very much more focused on what community produced that, what gave rise to that kind of suffering. Because that suffering comes from somewhere. We'd want to know where that suffering was born, and what are the conditions that have created it. And when he sort of expounded on that, it was like amazing to think of that as a paradigm for thinking, because I went back to Vermont and I was working in a penitentiary as a chaplain, and so often I'd see kids who were in the prisons. I remember being there one time and this young guy was sweeping, and I was waiting for somebody, and I was just watching him sweeping and thinking, what gave rise to you? Why are you here? He must have been 19, 20 years old. And I thought, whose sins are you paying for here? In that Christ-like sort of way that you think of one individual sort of carrying the guilt of a system, of a community, in the same way. Here's a 19, 20-year-old. Has he really earned being here? And what gave rise to...
Well, I guess that's what you said about the baby, right? Like the baby, you can't look at that full of sin. But the legal system will rightfully look at the baby and, but sinful. Then by they're 18, they're definitely, fully responsible for their actions, and there's a middle ground in the juvenile. Like, it's fascinating.
Changed my view of so many things, but this question of when you see stuff like that in somebody, for the Buddhist mind frame to say, where did that suffering come from? Let us understand what were the conditions that gave rise to that is a profound thing.
What I would want to do, firstly, though, is actually, as you were saying the first thing before you mentioned that, my mind was already kind of going there. But the linchpin of that relies on going to Tibet and that being true.
Is it still true? You're wondering.
Is it? Or was it ever? Like, is he just like jaded? Like, I'm sure the Catholic Pope probably says how good and peaceful Vatican is, or Christianity is, yet there's, the pedophilic priest. So, is that true? But let's take his word on it. Like, yeah, I had this. It wasn't a full out conversation because it was a very touchy subject. But yeah, the victim of such a crime, and in my head it's so clear. Yet it's easy for me to say it's so clear because I haven't been the victim of such a crime. But it's so clear that in a religious context, in a fate context, in just like an energetic context, the criminal, let's call them, will suffer just an internal, subconscious, spiritual sentence all on their own. And my concern personally isn't so much about the punishment, because that seems self-evident anyway.
Yeah.
Just by living with yourself, like, and I don't say this as in like I would feel bad, I'm so moral, like I would feel bad if I were murdered. I think anyone, even if it's just suffering from the pains, as you say, the pains and the symptoms of the kind of thing that would have caused you to ever do such a thing, that in its own has to be punishment enough. The only relevant question seems to be, okay, let's like not make more victims than we have to. You know what I mean? Yeah. Let's not like let a rapist roam the streets and just keep on doing it. But
that's right. Yes. Yeah.
It just seems so obvious to like, okay, whatever sufferings you're undergoing to be that, even if they feel naturalistic and, right for you.
Yeah.
They can't, like, it's almost impossible to admit to ourselves that it could be.
Yeah.
We need to like take them in and kind of test them and
try it on. As you sort of make your way, try that notion on, like, where did this come from?
Yeah.
What gave rise to that? It's a phenomenally radical departure from the way our system works at the moment, where some of those systems, some of those places aren't looked at all. I'll tell you, I went back to Vermont. We had a community in Woodstock, and I was sort of in a nonprofit that could do a lot of community work. And at one stage, one of the young women that had grown up with my son, she was voted to be the most likely to succeed. Bright, good grades, hard-working individual, poor family, living in a wealthy community. So for the last 2 years of high school, all these kids are, what college am I going to go to, and what's my career, and so on. She had all those ambitions. She listened to all those ambitions. When it came time for college, she couldn't afford it. Her parents couldn't afford it. So she finally ended up going to Wisconsin to a college there because her aunt lived there. And so her aunt said, she got a bit of a scholarship. Her aunt said, you can live with us. After a year of living with the aunt, the relationship soured and she couldn't stay there any longer. So she came back to Vermont and went to a state college. Nowhere near the reputation, nowhere near the challenge. After a year of state college, she was sort of realizing she was not stimulated enough. She was bored. No other options. She went to work for a bit. All her colleagues were finishing uni degrees. She was not finishing anything except working as a waitress. Got into a relationship with a guy who was a dealer. Within a few months, he had her hooked on heroin. She, no doubt, said to him, "You're doing this wrong. You know, here, do it like this." And because that's
The business model of
the
dealing.
business model, you know, she was much smarter than he was,
Yeah.
and she could. Police were watching her. They created a sting operation. They caught her in a couple of situations where she was clearly involved in the dealing. One day they showed up on a door and arrested her. And she had been somebody who'd often come to our house and who I knew really well. We knew her really well. By that time, Julian was already over here. And when her mother called and said, Laura's been arrested, here's the story, actually, somebody said she had called one time and said, "I'm in trouble."
Called you.
Yeah. And I'd gone and had a conversation within a short amount of time after that. She was arrested. And so it became clear that they were going to give her a state-appointed attorney, but they were thinking of doing a deal with her for her testimony because they were wanting to get all the others. And so she waited for a while this deal was. By the time her case came up, the state-appointed attorneys that were any good would already been assigned to others in that case. So the only people left for her to represent her were, and I had an attorney who I knew well, who was working in the state attorney's office. He said, "None of these attorneys are worth their salt. You know, if she is going to get through this, she needs a good attorney. But that'll cost you $20,000. You know, that'll cost somebody $20,000. Well, she didn't have $20,000. So it was interesting to go into a fundraising mode, and we actually raised $20,000 in order to give her what would have otherwise been a mandatory 22-year sentence. So for this individual who was by that time 21.
We're only talking 3 years from
3
getting
years.
most likely to be successful.
Yeah. 22 years mandatory sentence. She ended up getting 18 months and some probation time with the help of this attorney that we were able to get for her. And I was going to see her while she was in the prison for those 18 months, just to try to sustain her optimism and so on, because, you know, but the system, you know, knowing her that way, it was like, where did that come from? You know, and I found myself talking to the community and saying, she's a member of our community here. She didn't get there by herself. You know, it's her relationship to wealth.
I'm sure so many of those community members, especially if it was, you know, if they're maybe more on the material side and stuff, we don't want anything to do with, oh, no, like, you know, oh, we thought we were wrong, like,
yeah,
distance, because they see that could have been their own daughter, them, and they don't want to even acknowledge that.
Absolutely. And in raising those funds, it was a conversation with the community to say, she's ours. We have responsibility for where she is at the moment, because our entitlements, our privilege, the contrast of that has just sort of created the situation where, you know, all she could see was hopelessness. Anyway, it was one of those things that experience with the Tibetan monks sort of helped me prepare for it, to say, where did that come from? I see where that came from. To be exposed to that kind of conversation and that contrast between wealthy and poor, because she had a single mom who couldn't afford to send her anywhere else. It was just one of those things that she actually went on to have a really good relationship with a guy who really respected her, and last I know, she got a break with an assessor's office that, of course, being who she is, she did brilliantly. And the assessor, after she had done a placement with him for a year, said, come be a partner here. I really want you to work with me. And I believe that's what she's continued to do. So,
yeah.
So, you know, it's these systems have implications, and it's easy to put somebody in jail without asking, are we capable of addressing?
Well, you saw that in that little community, but that's the same story as a country community, as a nation community, isn't it?
Yeah.
And one that America and Australia lesser, but maybe just lesser because it's a small population seems to be not getting exactly right.
But these learning opportunities, Tim, they open doors that you don't really know what is behind in that room, but you open the door and then you realize that you discover things that you needed, the opportunities you wouldn't have had
and
otherwise.
You would have naturally, intuitively just been called to this Byron Bay thing, which obviously then led to that. I think so. We certainly were wanting to be in Australia. We needed to take a break because it was intense work for the years before that. So it was a nice place to go, and it turned out to be, Buddhism is a really interesting set of paradigms that are really lovely to consider. And as a finale to our conversation, one of the considerations of Buddhism, and especially Taoism, as it blends with Buddhism in Zen thinking, is that where you come back to is a place of emptiness. It's not, before anything happens, the real latency, the real possibilities exist in emptiness. A phenomenal shift for our Western thinking, where it's always about something, what started first, to this Taoist, Zen, Buddhist thinking, well, the thing that comes first and last, perhaps, is not nothing, but emptiness, a silence. And if you begin to think about getting back to that space of emptiness, of silence, of openness, of possibility, it's an incredible paradigm that is beautiful to play with. Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. Thank you. What a treat to have this conversation. Golly, I haven't talked this much in.
Oh, man, I could have gone for another. Yeah, that's great.
Oh, years. That's so good of you. Thank you, Tim, for being so curious and so willing to talk. And, and golly, I hope it serves you well. How can it not?
I mean, I can't. I'm going to. I knew going into it because, I'd seen you in the dinners and how you operate in general. I must have said this when I first, asked you. I actually knew nothing about you, really, but I was like, well, I can see how you operate in this microcosm. And to ever get to this... It's like when you see a 100-meter sprint 4 times, once every 4 years of the Olympics. You only seen them for 10 seconds. Yes. You know there's a lot behind that. And I was like, okay, so if this is the sprint, there's going to be such a story of elaboration behind it.
That's fun of you to see that.
And then I was Googling it last night. I was like, oh shit, this is going to be... It's going to have to do 2 parts here. This guy's going to be quite annoyed by me just wanting to go on and on and on.
Oh, that's good of you. Thank you. Thank you. I love the notion that doing a community dinner is a 100-meter sprint. It is sometimes. Yeah. But it's great fun.
I mean, if you don't mind, I just want to ask one more question.
Yeah.
Because, and we didn't fully dive into the details of this 10, 15-year stint in Vermont, but I was doing a full deep dive, and I was seeing photos of the farewell party and you and the kids, and they dedicated this garden they made for you, this permaculture garden and everything. So clearly you had such an impact and whatnot. You went to do this master's degree, which you got awarded for, but you said in this write-up that impelled you to come to Australia. And I just was wondering if there was more to that. It seems like in some sense you did have I don't know, right? That's why I'm asking. If it's the relationships, the money and the framework, at least from the outside, that seemed to be all covered in such a beautiful, holistic, centered, grounded way in this Vermont environment. What pulled you out of it? Imagine even 10 years later, there's the significant part of your heart still there. I can only imagine.
Yeah, I think it is. You know, when I left Australia in '79, I was only going for 2 years, and I was going to come back. And when I first went, I really was missing home, even though it was a great experience over there, and there were a lot of things I liked. So when Susan and I met in about 1980, 81, I said, I'm only here for a little while. I'm going home. And she said, I'll go. You know?
She said she'd follow you.
Yeah, I'll go to Australia. I'm interested in that. She'd had a fairly difficult life there. But then we said, but I'd love to see the Northwest, you know, let's get out to Oregon somehow and live out there for a couple of years. And then when we got done with that 4 or 5 years in Oregon, she was like, but could I go to Vermont for a couple of years, you know, and then we'll go to Australia, because I just want to reconnect to that place
now that
before
I'm
we
feeling
go.
good,
Yeah.
like, you know, I can rewrite the script a bit.
So we went to Vermont for a couple of years, but that ended up being over 30 years. But there was always the sense that we were going back to Australia. I think our kids grew up with that. So Julian, when he was looking at universities, he said, I'm not even looking at any universities in the United States. I want to go back to Australia. You know, having
Your daughter's called Sydney.
you don't go to Sydney, which now is sort of tricky. Are you okay with that? Yeah, I'm fine.
That was like the little part of home you had in Vermont, you know? At least I can have this.
Yeah. So they were both fairly attached to here and wanted to go and went. And so by the end of it, they were here and we were over there, and we wanted to go. So we didn't want to be separated that way. So it was always the plan. Vermont was not your typical United States experience. It was a great community, really interesting place to live. You must go sometime. It's
One of my
beautiful country.
when I was living in Guatemala, I call her my mum on the lake. I lived in this lake, and a very motherly figure who, you know, still I talk to all the time. I was talking to her the other week. She's from Vermont, and her parents are, so I had that connection as well.
Yeah.
Definitely feels like
you must go see her sometime. It's a beautiful country there. So no doubt it was a great place to live, and we stayed so long because it was a great place for kids to grow up and so on. But we were sort of always headed for here. And I have to say that the last few years of what's going on in the US, I'm glad to be here, and I think we all are.
Yeah.
And
it hasn't felt like you kind of had the prime of your career and then you've like kind of slipped into this weird retirement, but you feel fulfilled enough and kind of emboldened enough in this.
Yeah, you know, I think I probably burned out a bit. I mean, it was 15 years of just
being the shaman, essentially.
Yeah. But a lot of work, a lot of hours, a lot of, you know, it's amazing in a community like that, even a community of 3,500 people, you know, how many opportunities there are to help people, support people, to opportunities to address issues and so on. And knowing that and sort of engaging with that in a sort of way that could facilitate others getting engaged with it in a real way just was a lot of work. And I don't know that I realized how much, until I came here, how much I was burned out, I think. So this position has been lovely in its sort of I think less expectations, or at least you can calibrate your expectations of yourself to some extent. It's been a really good cultural experience in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah. So.
All right, now I feel done. Thank you. I'm sure you want to like piss and
Thank you, Jim. What a fun conversation. I must find out more about you. If you're open to another cup of coffee,
yeah, for sure, anytime.
I'd love to hear about Guatemala. And shall I press this to turn it off?
No, you're all right.